when you're at high intensity, so when I'm above that second threshold, but when I'm below about that 2-minute max effort, this is where VO2 max is going to manifest itself. Now, if I go into a short effort, like something I can only hold for a minute, I'm not even going to have time to reach my VO2 max.
What is your current view of how we should be viewing conditioning with regards to physiology?
For me, the basis of all my thinking around endurance is the intensity spectrum with those 4 different levels. And so if we dig into this just a little bit more, I talked about the low intensity, medium intensity, high intensity, and very high intensity. So let's get a bit more detailed on this, because that's the foundation of everything. Based on this, if you understand the spectrum, then you can reason coherently regarding the energy systems that we talked about at the beginning. And you can see how they interact in those different levels. And then you can go a step up from that intensity spectrum and think about training, and think about zones, and think about actually creating the training sessions that will help you build those different qualities, right? So if we break down that spectrum just a little bit more, I gave this kind of the simple names: low, medium, high, very high intensity. If you read the physiology literature, you're going to find those called domains. There's 4 intensity domains, and the low intensity is called the moderate domain. The medium intensity is called the heavy domain. The high intensity is called the severe domain, and then the very high intensity is called the extreme domain. Now, one of the most important parts of physiological testing is to essentially parse out those domains and figure out, okay, for me on the bike, I know that the transition between low and medium intensity is around 140 watts. And the transition between the medium and the high intensity is around 230 watts, right? So we would say that my first threshold transition from low to medium is around 140 watts. And my second threshold is a transition between the medium and the high intensity around 230 watts. So that would be on the physiology side. Now, to quickly address what we call the extreme domain, or the very high intensity, there's no real tests that are useful to find it, and there's no practical implications to knowing that exactly where it is on the spectrum for you. All I would say is that it's typically around 2 minutes of hard effort, right? So around that, you switch from typically high intensity to very high intensity. And for those who like the details, the difference between the two is going to be in whether or not you reach VO2 max. So typically VO2 max is not a power, it's not a speed, it's something that you reach when you spend enough time at high intensity, right? Because we go back to those 4 levels. When we're at low intensity, we could conceptualize that as a balance or a steady state inside the muscle itself. Going back to the energy systems, we know that at low intensity, you produce very little lactate. And lactate is not the cause of fatigue, but lactate comes with a bunch of other things that cause fatigue: inorganic phosphates, hydrogen ions, and those things, right? So when I say lactate, it's just a good surrogate for the fatigue metabolites. It's not the cause of fatigue itself. Lactate is a half sugar. Your body uses it inside the mitochondria, right? It's fuel. It's not fatigue. But we know that at low intensity, you produce very little lactate, and you can recycle all of it inside the cell, right? Inside the mitochondria itself. Hence the balance at the muscular level. You're not offsetting any of those metabolites inside the blood, because you can internally manage that load. So low intensity is a steady state at the muscular level, or at the local level, right? So your quad is doing the work when you're running or cycling, and nothing's getting out into the blood because everything can be recycled internally. That's low intensity. Now we go up a level to medium intensity. And what did we say about the lactate and everything that happens inside the cell? We said that the mitochondria is now saturated, right? It's dealing with as much lactate and stuff as it can, but it can't do any more than that. So what is it going to do? It's going to pass the excess onto the blood and the rest of the body. So now we have a steady state, but at the systemic level, at the global level of the body, right? So low intensity, local equilibrium or balance or homeostasis, medium intensity, systemic balance. And then once we go beyond what we call the second threshold, so for me, when I go from 200 watts to 260 watts, for example, I go beyond that second threshold, I go into high intensity, and now I can no longer maintain that internal balance. I can't bring enough oxygen to deal with all the stuff that's going on. That's essentially how you can conceptualize the second threshold. It's the maximum oxygen you can deliver to your muscles. And just because essentially the tap is open as much as you can, right? But the tub is still emptying, even though you've maxed out the tap essentially. And so what happens is you keep using more and more oxygen because why? We're recruiting more and more fibers. We're trying to produce more and more power. On top of this, the fast twitch fibers, they fatigue. And so when they fatigue, you have to go recruit other ones to do the job that the other ones didn't do. It kind of that runaway effect. And where I was getting with this is that now you're at high intensity, you can no longer maintain that balance inside. Right.
Yeah.
And that's physiologically, that's the best way to tie together the energy systems that we talked about before, the functioning of the body as a whole, and then those different levels of intensity. And to conclude on what I was saying before, when you're at high intensity, so when I'm above that second threshold, but when I'm below about that 2-minute max effort, this is where VO2max is going to manifest itself. Now, if I go into a short effort, like something I can only hold for a minute, I'm not even going to have time to reach my VO2max, right? Because you fatigue locally before you even reach your maximal oxygen consumption. And this is the distinction between high and very high intensity. This is where the difference lies between the two. So it's interesting to know it on the theoretical level, but concretely speaking, it's not interesting to measure it, right? So for me, there's really threshold 1, threshold 2, which break apart the first 3 domains of intensity, and then your max speed or your max power at the very, very top, which then gives you your whole intensity spectrum and everything that you have to know. And then based on that, that's the basic model. And then now we can start using zones, right? Jem, my colleague, says that domains are descriptive, meaning that those intensity domains that I gave you describe what is going on internally, right? So if we think of lactate, low intensity, we have very low lactate levels and they stay steady. Medium intensity, you have raised lactate levels, and it's gonna be raised, but it's gonna be stable in time. High intensity is gonna keep going up and up and up until you have to stop. And then very high intensity on the lactate side is the same as the high intensity, just faster, right? Because you are using even more fast twitch fibers and you are fatiguing even faster. So we can describe what's happening with the physiology through the lens of those intensity domains or those 4 levels. Now the zones, they're prescriptive, meaning that we use them to prescribe training. And essentially what we're going to do is take those 4 levels and break them up into smaller pieces to help our tiny little human brains understand what we're trying to achieve, right? And so once we start applying the zone model to the intensity spectrum, because again, a zone is not a heart rate, right? That's a huge mistake that I see in the endurance world, is that we take our max heart rate, whether it's calculated or measured, doesn't matter, and then we take, okay, 70%, that's my zone 2. Well, 70% is correct for the average population, but you're not the average. And you could be somewhere between 55% of heart rate max all the way to 80% of heart rate max at your first threshold. And that's going to change with training and with time as well, right? So we can't just take a fixed number. And we have to consider that there's a lot of variation in a given population. And then so based on those 4 levels, we can start to talk about zones. So typically zone 1 and zone 2 are at low intensity. Zone 1, we typically say, is active recovery. Zone 2 is base endurance. So zone 2 would be, if we had to give numbers, I would say between maybe 70 and 100% of your first threshold. So for me, my first threshold is at 140 watts on the bike. So my zone 2 would be, I don't know, 100 to 140, let's say. Okay. And if I'm below that, I'm at an active recovery. And if I'm between 100 and 140, I'm in my zone 2. But there's no physiological distinction between zone 1 and zone 2. That's just an arbitrary number or an arbitrary boundary that I gave because we split up zone 1 and zone 2, right?
And I just want to double reiterate that that's what's not beats per minute, just because those
Watts.
numbers might confuse people.
Exactly. So the watts are on the bike, and obviously there's going to be a heart rate associated with that power output. So for me, at 140 watts, I might be at, I don't know, 115, 120 beats. So that's my zone 2 heart rate. But it's based first on the threshold concept, which is at 140 watts. And then secondarily, I measured my heart rate at that intensity. I didn't do math on my heart rate to figure out my zone 2, right? Because it's the power that's going to determine what's going on inside. It's not the heart rate. Because on a good day, I might be 5 beats lower. On a bad day, or if I'm sick, I might be 5 or 10 beats higher. If it's very hot outside, I might be 10, 15 beats higher.
Definitely.
All those things can influence heart rate, right?
That's so important. I think I just want everyone to take a pause to sort of soak that one in, because we obsess with our heart rates, and I've been guilty of this myself. But that's so immaterial in the grand scheme of things. We care about our performance and our output, so we should measure everything based on our output, which is watts.
I think that there's the and I'll come back to the zones, but I think a good little aside here is Steven Seiler's 3 Ps: performance, physiology, and perception. So ideally, you want to have that 3-pronged approach to quantifying any type of endurance effort. So obviously, first you have what we call the external load. So the power, the output, the power that you're producing, the speed that you're running at, that's your external load, and that's a performance metric, right? You always want to couple that with the perception side of things. So how you feel, right? And I'm the first to love data and science and all that stuff. RPE is extremely well established in the literature. I actually have a mini course about it. I'll send it to you so you can check it out. But it's very well researched. It has been for decades, and it's probably the most useful metric that you can have in training. Learn to listen to yourself. And it's a skill like every other skill. So if you've never listened to yourself, you can't just throw your hands up in the air and say, I don't know how to listen to myself, so I won't do it. No, it's just that you've never done it. But start doing it, put in the reps, ask yourself, how does it feel? How does it feel? How hard is it? How hard is it? And the more you do it, the more precise you get. And so that's the perception side. You have the external load, the performance metric, whether it's watts on a bike, kilometers per hour, or miles per kilometer, or minutes per kilometer in running. And then you have the perception side of things. The easiest is use the 1 to 10 scale. So how is it? And obviously, it's going to depend on the type of effort you're doing. Meaning that you can do a 3-day long hike, and it could be a 10 out of 10 if it's really hard, right? But you could also do a 2-second sprint, and it feels like it's maybe a 2 or 3 in terms of difficulty. It's 100% effort, but it's easy in terms of fatigue and difficulty, right? So it's always contextual to the time that you're using it on. That's important to consider. And that would be part of the internal load, right? We have the external load with the output, and the internal load is the perception and the physiology. So if you have heart rate or if you have lactate, those are all good metrics to also use. But you have to base the foundation of your thinking around the performance metric, the external load, and then your perception. And then you layer in the physiology with the heart rate or the lactate, right? So I'm not saying that heart rate isn't useful. Heart rate is extremely useful, but you have to know how to contextualize it based on what we talked about before, right? You can't just take a number out of the air and say, oh, that's my zone X because my watch told me so. Yeah, your watch takes your estimated or calculated max heart rate, and then it applies those basic percentages that are true on a population level, but that are wrong for almost every person individually, and says these are your zones. And they don't make the difference between the bike and then the run, because your heart rate is going to be different on the run than it is on the bike, right? Some people could have high heart rate on the bike compared to the run if they bike a lot but never run, right? So always contextualize the heart rate, but found your thinking around the external load, the performance metric, and your perception internal metric first, and then you layer in the heart rate. Okay, so that's the 3 Ps: performance, perception, physiology from Steven Seiler. That is a very useful model to quantify any type of effort.
Awesome.
And what I'll do just after I give you the zones is I'll give some RPEs, some difficulty levels that can be associated with each zone. So it helps us actually approach endurance in a very, very simple way and just learn how to listen to your body and know where you are. Because sure, we could do a lactate test, we could do a VO2 test, we could do all that complicated stuff, but you can also just pay attention to how your body feels and have a really good rough understanding of what is low intensity for you, what is medium intensity for what is high intensity for you. And you could do that over less than 30 minutes, right? And I can give that to you at the end if you want. So we had zone 1 and zone 2, which were on the low intensity side of things. Now, zone 3 and 4 typically are going to be over the medium intensity. Okay. Now, zone 4 is typically considered the threshold, right? That's what we call it. And it talks about the second threshold, right? We had the first threshold that's at the top of low intensity. And on the zone model, it's going to be between zone 2 and zone 3. And then we're going to have the second threshold that's between the medium and the high intensity. And now it's zone 4 that's almost kind of straddling a little bit those two domains. Because those thresholds, I gave you 140, 230 for me on the bike. They're not to the watt, right? They're more like phase transitions. So again, thresholds are wrong, but they're useful as a model to understand the intensity spectrum. And they're also going to change with fatigue, right? For me, it's 230 when I'm fresh. Make me cycle for 2 hours and then test my thresholds again. It's no longer 230. It's maybe 200, right? And that's actually one of the features of highly trained endurance athletes is their durability or their resistance to fatigue. So their second threshold is at, 370 watts when they're fresh, and it's 360 watts after 4 hours of cycling, right? Whereas for most people, it would drop by 10% or more. And this is one of the performance factors in long duration endurance sports, right? So we have that zone 3, zone 4 that are kind of over that medium intensity. And the way I like to frame it is that zone 3 is closer to the first threshold. So the intervals will be longer because they're less intense, whereas zone 4 is closer to the second threshold. So intervals will be a little bit shorter, right? But physiologically speaking, there's no difference between zone 3 and zone 4. You can't measure a difference in lactate. Oh, sure, the lactate is going to be a little bit higher when you're in zone 4 than it is in zone 3, but it's still going to stay stable over time. And this is why the Norwegians use lactate as one of their main means of monitoring training. It's because they do, especially in the endurance sports, they do a lot of tempo, zone 3, threshold, zone 4 sessions, which both have the feature of what? Of a stable internal state, right? So you're going to see maybe 2.5 millimoles on your tempo sessions, but that's going to stay stable across the session. And you might see 3.5 to 4.5 millimoles on your threshold sessions, but that's going to stay from interval to interval again. So that medium intensity can be easily monitored using something like lactate. The difficulty with heart rate there is that you're invariably going to have a heart rate drift as soon as you go beyond the low intensity, which should, if you're in zone 2, an easy way to see if you're in zone 2 or not is if your heart rate stays nice and flat. Right? Can you do an hour with your heart rate not moving? If it starts moving up after 10 minutes, you're going too hard, or you're just not used to that effort yet, and you need to maybe work it in smaller chunks, or you need to even slow down so that you keep a stable heart rate, right? But as soon as you go into medium intensity or above, your body's going to progressively fatigue because we're recruiting more fast twitch fibers, which are less efficient, and then this whole cycle continues, and you're going to see that heart rate drift from interval to interval. And obviously, the more you train, the less drift you're going to have, but you're still going to have drift. So you can't say, I'm staying exactly at, let's say somebody says, my zone 3 is between 70 and 80% of my heart rate max. So my zone 3 is between 120 and 140 beats, right? But if you start at 140 beats on your first interval, it's going to be 143, 145, 147 on the next intervals. So that's, again, contextualizing the heart rate to help us understand what is going on is super important. Right. So we have that zone 3, zone 4. So zone 5, high intensity. Right. That's simple. It's just the high intensity above second threshold up to, like we said, about 2-3 minutes of effort. Right. That's going to be considered high intensity or zone 5. And then beyond that, so that's the typical 5-zone model that you find on the watches and with heart rate and stuff like that. But we didn't touch the very high intensity, right? The extreme domain. And that really how you break that up into zones really depends on what you're trying to do with your training. I give you a concrete example. If you're training for a marathon, you're going to spend very little time at very high intensity. Maybe you're just going to do some speed work right at the beginning of your training phase, because it's important to coordinate that. It can improve economy. There's many benefits to learn how to run fast properly, but you're not going to be doing sprint interval training running. You're not going to be doing really hard 400 or 200 repeats. So typically when you do long endurance work, you don't even talk about what's happening beyond zone 5. Now, another example would be my friend Vincent, who used to compete in indoor rowing on the 500-meter discipline. So sprint, that's going to take him a minute and 17 seconds, I think, was kind of his time. Obviously, he's going to spend a lot of time in that very high intensity domain with different types of training, some short intervals, some longer intervals. So he uses 9 zones, meaning there's the classic 5 that we went over, which cover the low, medium, high intensity. But then his very high intensity is broken up into 4 chunks. Wow. Based on the type of training that he's going to be doing. Right? I like to break it up into 2. So I've got a zone 6 and a zone 7 for, again, most people, most contexts, where zone 7 is the very high end. So short sprints, I would call it. And then zone 6 would be long sprints. And typically long sprints hurt more than short sprints. Right? So we could kind of break those apart like that.